we're going to do is really talk about noise-induced hearing loss, but you can't talk about noise-induced hearing loss without talking about other forms of hearing loss. So we'll be doing that as well. What I hope to do, now come on. Is talk about the definition of a hearing threshold, because you really need to know about that just to understand how hearing is actually measured. We'll talk about different factors that influence hearing loss, including gender, age, genetics. We'll look at some comparable noise sources and non-occupational hearing loss sources, and we'll look at some occupations that are associated with hearing loss. And then just kind of wrap it all up and give you a kind of an idea of how to really think about hearing loss when, you know, a hearing loss claim comes to your desk, things that you, if you're going to do an interview of the injured worker, things that you should be thinking about when you do that. So right off the bat, hearing loss is, you know, starts at the ear. And the ear is obviously our organ of sound perception. Sound waves enter the outer ear and travel through this narrow passageway called the ear canal, and that leads to the eardrum. And that's why we like to have our ears cleaned out, no wax in the ears. We hear better with that. The eardrum vibrates from the sound waves that enter the ear canal, and those vibrations actually move these three tiny bones in the middle ear, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. The bones in the middle ear actually then vibrate, and they couple the sound waves from the air in the outer ear to the fluid in the inner ear. Okay, and that fluid in the inner ear is called the cochlea, and that's kind of that shell-shaped item here. That's the cochlea, and the cochlea is really important, and if you will, that is where hearing loss actually occurs. As sound enters in, the fluid in the cochlea actually forms waves. There's this partition that runs through the cochlea, and it divides the cochlea in half. And that partition is lined with these little hair cells. And as a fluid wave is sent down the cochlea, it causes that partition, this basement membrane, to move around. Once vibrations cause that fluid inside the cochlea to ripple, a wave forms along the basilar membrane, and that wave causes hair cells that are sitting on top of it to start to move around. They actually ride this wave. Those hair cells move up and down, and these microscopic projections called stereocilia that perch on top of the hair cells bump up against the structure of the cochlea, and they bend. And that bending opens these pores in the stereocilia, and those pores cause chemicals to rush into the cell. And those chemicals cause the cell to actually send an electrical signal. And those electrical signals then are projected through the cochlea to your auditory nerve. The auditory nerve then goes to your brain, and your brain then turns that sound into something that you will actually understand. It might be the sound of wind in the trees, or a creek rushing by, or a bird chirping, or your child yelling that they want more ice cream. All of those things are done in the inner ear. One of the things that's not on this slide is that these hair cells actually vary in length. And the longer hair cells are the ones that are responsible for low frequency hearing. The really short, tiny ones are responsible for high frequency hearing. And it is the short, tiny ones that are the most susceptible to loud noises and those huge fluid waves that we see.
John, we have a question in
Sure.
the group chat. Where does barotrauma occur?
Where does what? Barotrauma.
barotrauma, sorry.
Okay, barotrauma, that is right there. Now, so the other thing that can happen with really severe barotrauma is you can, if you will, air can hit the eardrum at such a high pressure that it actually can cause fracturing of the bones in the middle ear. It can rupture the eardrum. You read about this in war stories of people that are just outside of the blast zone of a bomb. It doesn't kill them, but when they get up, their ears are bleeding, and their nose is bleeding. Is because of the overpressure causing that direct trauma to the ear canal and to the tympanic membrane. But the barotrauma also, and we'll talk about this later, we call it impulse trauma, if you will, can also affect the hair cells in the middle ear. Depending upon a number of variables that we'll talk about, that barotrauma may cause a temporary loss of hearing. With repeated barotrauma, however, you can have a permanent loss of hearing. But the barotrauma you're asking about, it can occur and cause problems with the eardrum and with the bones in the middle ear. But the primary anatomy, the primary body part that is affected by all noise is actually the inner ear inside the cochlea, and is these hair cells that we've been discussing. Those guys are the ones we have to protect. Hope that's answered the question. All right, so now I want to talk about hearing thresholds. This is kind of something that you're going to hear about. You may have employers tell you that someone has a standard threshold shift. We're not going to go into that because, again, that's a part of hearing conservation, and we're not going to talk about hearing conservation today. But hearing thresholds are defined as the lowest level of sound that can be heard 50% of the time. And so what they'll do is they'll put you in a booth, or they'll have you wear these noise-canceling headphones, and then they will give you pulses at a particular decibel level and at a particular frequency. And they might give you 10 pulses, and they will say that you have heard it when you hear at least half of those pulses at that frequency and at that decibel level. So they might start at 10 decibels and give you 500 hertz. And a hertz is a cycle per second. That's the frequency of the sound. And that gives you the pitch of the sound. And then you'll listen to that. And if you don't hear half of 10 pulses at 500, at 10 decibels, they'll go up to 15. See if you hear those. They'll go up to 20 until they finally get to the point where, oh, I hear those now. Okay, and that is your hearing threshold for that frequency. And the decibel is this, if you will, it's just a unit of sound intensity. This is another thing that I'm not going to go into. I'm going to say that decibels are not, it is not an arithmetic kind of a number. It's actually a logarithmic number. So it turns out the way it's set up that every 2.5 decibels actually indicates a doubling of the sound intensity. So if you go from 82.5 to 85 decibels, you've actually doubled the sound intensity, okay? And we get nervous in the US. We don't like anything above 85 decibels. In Europe, they go to 80 decibels over an 8-hour time-weighted average. So, but that's what a decibel actually is. And there's all kinds of other little things, dBA and dBB and dBZ. Those are different scales, different ways of measuring sound intensity. But for our purposes, a decibel is just a unit of sound intensity. And then when we measure the, hearing, we look for various hearing thresholds, if you will, at different frequencies. We typically look at 500 cycles per second, 500 hertz, 1,000 hertz, 2,000 hertz. Some people will do 1,500 hertz, but usually 500, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 6,000, and 8,000. For the adjusters in the room, if we're doing an impairment rating, the AMA guides only is concerned with hearing thresholds at 500, 1,000, 2,000, and 3,000 hertz, and that's all they care about. So one of the things that you need to know is that aging can cause you to lose your hearing. I think everybody has probably experienced that or met people who have lost hearing just because of their age. The hearing threshold, or the amount of sound intensity required to hear a particular frequency, increases with age. And by the time you're 60, you've probably lost 30 to 40, your hearing thresholds have probably increased to 30 to 40 decibels in males and about 20 decibels in females. And the part of the subtext for this is that women lose less hearing due to aging than men do. And that's something that's been repeatedly observed in research. So these next couple of slides kind of describe what that looks like. So there's this thing called a percentile, and I want to go into this just so that you can get an idea of what these slides actually mean. A percentile is a way to rank a person's findings compared to the rest of the population. And usually when you say someone's in the 90th percentile, that means that 90% of people are worse than they are, and only 10% are better than they are. But in this case, the percentile rankings have to do with how much hearing has been lost. And so the 90th percentile is actually the people with the worst hearing. That means that if you're in the 90th percentile, 90% of people have better hearing than you do. If you're in the 10th percentile, that means only 10% of people have better hearing than you do. And so you can see from this that, the green line is the 90th percentile line. In men, when they're 30 years old, they might on average have a hearing threshold, and this is average of 3,000 to 6,000 hertz in a better air. They might only be at 30 decibels. But by the time they are, in their 60s, their hearing threshold has gone up to 70 decibels. The people with the best hearing at age 30, their hearing threshold is pretty close to 0. It's 2. But by the time they're 60, their hearing threshold has gone up to 14. Now, I want you to pay attention to this because this is in men. Now we're going to go to women, and you'll see a big difference in the hearing thresholds. In women, as you can see, there is much less hearing loss. And so for a woman in the 90th percentile, their hearing threshold on average at 30 years old is only 18 decibels. By the time they're 60, it goes up to 46 decibels. Whereas if you're in the 10th percentile, that means 10% of people are better than you, 90% have worse hearing than you. You actually are hearing very, very well at age 30. You're hearing your baby, maybe squeaking in the next room, wanting to get changed before they start screaming. And by the time you're 60, you still can hear the baby kind of bubbling and laughing to itself in the next room. I mean, your hearing threshold's only 8 decibels on average. But the 90th percentile hearing loss for women, as you can see, compared to men at age 60, in women, it's 46 decibels. In men, it's 70. So women have much better hearing throughout the life cycle in men on average. And a comment on the side of this is that by far, absolutely, the number of people that I see for hearing loss claims, it's always men. I can't even remember the time I've seen a woman for a hearing loss claim. I just haven't. It just doesn't happen, really. So this is a typical age-related audiogram. And we're going to talk about what a typical noise-induced hearing loss audiogram looks like a little bit later. But as you can see, and this kind of shows up in our previous slides, in the lower frequencies, you have better hearing. But because hearing loss, both age-related and noise-induced, tend to affect the higher frequencies first, those are the more sensitive hair cells in the inner ear, you'll see loss of hearing in the higher frequencies. So 2,000 hertz, you're a little bit worse, 4,000 a little bit worse, 8,000 a little bit worse. And this is really typical. If anyone were to get an audiogram and then retest in 5 years, you would find that it would follow this kind of pattern where you'd start losing the higher frequencies first. And this is sitting in an office, not being exposed to significant amounts of noise, just living your life and not having the noise exposures or not having anything else going on. But turns out that age isn't the only thing that is causing hearing loss. We found that twins often have a predisposition. So if one twin has a predisposition for having hearing problems, their twin, regardless of their occupation, will also likely have hearing loss. The same thing occurs in siblings. And we're going to talk about this a little later when we're doing our hearing loss interviews. Do you have family members, parents that have hearing loss or lost hearing at a relatively young age, or siblings that lost hearing at a relatively young age? Those have been shown to be associations with hearing loss that are independent of noise exposure. Most studies show that between a half and 2/3 of the variation in hearing acuity, when you adjust it for age, can be attributed to differences in genetic susceptibility. So what they do is they will take a huge number of people with their audiograms, and they will ask them about family history. And then they'll do a thing called a multivariate analysis, and they like to see what amount of their hearing loss can be statistically significantly associated with genetics, with family history of hearing loss. And they find that about a half to 2/3 of the variability in hearing acuity is just genetics. It's just, well, gee, these people have family members. It's a genetic problem. It's not anything else. I can't pronounce this name. Kvetstad showed that the upper limit of heritability for hearing loss, that's the proportion of variation in population attributable to genes. So again, it's that multivariate analysis, is about 36%. And so 30% in his study, 30% of the hearing loss that was observed could be attributed to genes, the variation in loss of hearing, or rather this variable, loss of hearing, 36% of the loss of hearing they saw in that population could be attributed simply to the person's genetic background. But, obviously genetics and age and gender are just 3 variables. There's also noise, and our ears are very sensitive to noise. I wanted to give you an idea of some of the exposures that are out there that one can actually experience. Gunshots, everybody would expect that to be, but a lot of people don't realize that airbag deployments are very, very loud, actually louder than being close to a jet taking off from an airport. Rock concerts are loud, but again, not that loud, not compared to an airbag deployment or a gunshot. Diesel locomotives, anyone that stood next to a railroad track, I used to do that when I was a kid, the trains that go by, and you want to count the train cars as they're going by. And, it's still pretty loud, 100 decibels. Motorcycles and lawnmowers, they're pretty loud. It's always recommended you wear hearing protection when you're going to run your lawnmower. Now, and then this level, this OSHA level for hearing conservation programs is 85 decibels. What that means is basically if there's a workplace where someone goes in and does noise dosimetry testing to look at what the average noise level is over an 8-hour period. And if that average noise level over an 8-hour period is at or exceeds 85 decibels, OSHA says that workplace needs to have a hearing conservation program. And that hearing conservation program typically involves regular dosimetry testing of the workplace and also regular audiograms or hearing testing for all the employees that are in that workplace, looking for a thing we call a standard threshold shift. And that's done annually. And then also, although it's not mandated in the US, there are other countries where if you have to put in a hearing conservation program. They also require the employees to wear hearing protection, and OSHA will also kind of look at you and ask, what have you done to engineer out some of these hearing or rather noise sources? So either enclosing loud machinery, soundproofing, rooms that are really loud, making people that enter the rooms wear hearing protection when entering those rooms, those kinds of things. Your typical conversation is 60 decibels. We every so often will, I have got a little property outside of Superior, and it's got a creek that runs through it. And for all that it sounds really loud right now because we're at spring runoff, we've done the noise sampling and it's maybe 55 decibels standing right next to the creek. In the summertime, when the creek is down, it might get down to 40 decibels. Quiet room is 50 decibels, and then whispering 30 to 40 decibels. So obviously there are lots of causes of hearing loss. This was a really interesting study, again, looking at a multivariate analysis of pure tone audiograms and questionnaire data. Now, the thing that you always got to worry about when you see these studies is how did they validate the questionnaires? How did they figure out that the person was actually telling them, well, not the truth, but giving them accurate information? So, and we're not going to talk about that. That's another thing. Validation and all of that is kind of an epidemiology thing. But if we take it at face value, what they did was they took pure tone audiograms and questionnaire data, and they looked at histories and leisure noise exposures, head injuries, all this stuff. And they got nearly 52,000 people, okay? And then they put it in, put on all of those variables and compared those variables to their pure tone audiograms. And then they looked at how much variability was related to rather variability in their hearing loss was related to these different things. And so age alone explained 30 to 58% of the variability in hearing loss. Noise, ear infections, and head injury explained about 1 to 6% of the variability in hearing loss, okay? And exposure to impulse noise, so hunting, sport shooting, airbags, those kinds of things, that was 7 to 8%, rather 7 to 8 decibel loss in the same group. But they didn't find really any effect in this study in the use of personal stereo players or headphones or going to concerts and substantial long-term hearing loss. Now, this is an older study, and since that time, we've kind of gotten a better understanding of different kinds of impulse noise and the difference between long-term and short-term hearing loss. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But as you can see, age, again, it keeps coming back to that. And, for the adjusters in the audience, you will notice that it's always the case, not necessarily always, but fairly common that the person that is filing a hearing loss claim is at least 60 years old. They're always older workers. And that's because age is probably the strongest predictor of hearing thresholds. Medications can also cause hearing loss. Aminoglycosides, gentamicin, it's an antibiotic. We don't use it anymore, but back in the day when I was in training and somebody came in and they had a bad infection and you didn't know what they had, you'd give them triples. And, triple was something that worked against anaerobes. So you give them Flagyl, something that like a penicillin or one of the amoxicillins, one of those first generation cephalosporins, and aminoglycoside, something like gentamicin. You give them triple antibiotics, you do blood cultures, figure out what they have. And usually blood cultures, well, you could get gram stains in a day. Blood cultures would take 7 days. The person would be on these drugs for a good week before you figured out if they needed to be on all those drugs. Aminoglycosides are very ototoxic. They are really strongly associated with hearing loss. Quinines also, those are used to be used for muscle spasms and the like. Beta blockers, you don't see those used much more for hypertension. Diuretics, again, for hypertension, but also for congestive heart failure. We really use those sparingly, and we don't put people on them for long periods of time. We have much better drugs than those for dealing with that. But the one that is really interesting is non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. Everybody gets one of those with a musculoskeletal injury, and people with things like osteoarthritis will remain on them for months, if not years. They are associated with hearing loss just on their own. Tricyclic antidepressants are also associated. Salicylates are, basically acetylsalicylic acid. Salicylates are aspirin, and compounds that are derived from aspirin. Those are also sources of hearing loss. So that being said, there are a bunch of different occupations that have been studied with respect to hearing loss. And there are a number of occupations you need to think about when someone comes to you and says, I've got hearing loss. And as I was speaking, it said, I never get women. I have to say, no, that's not true, because I did have a woman who came to me and said she had hearing loss, and it was because of the, I want to say it was a piece of office equipment that was in her vicinity that had been really loud one day, and ever since then she had ringing in the ears, and her audiograms really didn't show anything. And I ended up saying, I don't really see anything, and it was just a single day, and the data shows that those kind of impulse exposures don't do this. You get better after a while. So sorry, can't really get behind you with that one. But there are occupations that do cause hearing loss, factory work, car manufacturing, agricultural equipment factories, places where they make, the combines and the stuff. Electroplating and welding, those are really, really noisy. Grinding, stone crushing. The textile industry, where you're making these huge amounts of fabric. One of the things that I found was really interesting was working at 3M when you make tape. So tape is 3M, they make it by the mile and sell it by the inch. That's the slogan. And the tape bands that were made would be 8 foot wide, and they might be, gosh, I don't know, half a mile long. And they would be wound onto a really long spindle, and then coated with whatever color or adhesive or whatever, and then wound onto something else. And just the winding on and off, just unsticking that tape from one roller and putting it onto another roller could give you 120 decibels. It was just stunning. So all of those rollers had to be completely enclosed to engineer out the noise exposures that would have otherwise been a problem. People that work in commercial fishing, in the merchant marine, all of those, there's tons of, on the decks of ships, there's tons of diesel and gasoline engines and generators. If you go down in the engineering department where you've got turbines or, steam boilers, all of those things are extremely loud, 120 decibels. Those are very, very noisy environments. The entertainment industry, people that work in sports as referees, sound technicians, nightclub employees, bartenders, all of those folks are exposed to a large amount of noise, and that noise is fairly constant. You can't, especially in places like nightclubs, bars, that you can't have those folks wearing, hearing protection, because they need to be able to hear the customers. So those are very, very, and it's interesting to me that I have yet to really get any hearing loss claims from that industrial sector in Montana. I have, however, gotten hearing loss claims from firefighters. That's something that's real frequent, actually. Firefighters, and to a lesser degree, law enforcement officers, people that work in auto body shops, in welding shops, in truss manufacturing shops where they're making these huge wooden trusses and using electric saws all the time. All of those kinds of places can be very, very loud. Hospital professionals, there are certain areas of hospitals, and the one that really comes to mind, if anyone's ever had an MRI, I think you'll know that MRIs are very, very loud. You as the person getting the one MRI may not have that much exposure, but the technician that's out in the booth actually doing the, recording the study, they're the ones that are getting exposed. And then finally, the construction industry, tons and tons of, equipment that's being used, saws and hammers, both pneumatic and hydraulic equipment that produces a large amount of sound or a large amount of noise. One of the things that we also see a lot of is not just pure hearing loss. Invariably, the reason that someone files a claim is because of the combination of hearing loss and tinnitus, or ringing in the ears, and they are highly associated. And only recently have hearing aids actually been able to help people with tinnitus, with ringing in the ears. They use noise canceling hearing aids to help with that. And I've met people that have received those kinds of hearing aids, and they say they're nothing short of miraculous. They hear better than they did when they were 20, they say. But there are lots of industries where tinnitus is a real problem, and we need to be aware of that. Often I will get a hearing loss claim, and it actually isn't a hearing loss claim, it's a tinnitus claim. They'll get the audiogram, and they'll have evidence of noise-induced hearing loss, but it isn't really all that bad. Their hearing thresholds aren't really horrible, but what they find the most uncomfortable and distracting is tinnitus. Tinnitus is a major source of insomnia and anxiety and social isolation. So one of the things that I have had every so often, someone will come in and they'll have this audiogram that shows hearing thresholds that are 90 or 100 decibels, okay? And it's like, so they're deaf, basically, and I'll be in there interviewing them, and I'm all but shouting, each question, everything I need to do, I'm shouting it at them in the exam room. And they show 80 and 90 decibel hearing thresholds, which is crazy. They've done some studies. Although ACOM, the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine, did a task force on hearing loss and came up with a statement. This is based on a really large European study where they looked at, this whole idea of how much of the hearing loss could be attributed to noise versus other sources of hearing loss. And what they discovered was, really noise can only produce less than 75 decibels in the higher frequencies and 40 decibels in the lower frequencies. Let me unpack that. That means that if someone has a hearing threshold at 3,000 hertz of 90 decibels, probably only 75 decibels of that is related to noise. And the next 15 decibels is probably other factors, genetics, age, those kinds of things. Someone who has, a 50 or 60 decibel hearing threshold at like 2,000 hertz or 1,000 hertz, probably only 40 decibels of that loss of hearing is related to noise, and the remainder, again, is related to other factors such as age, genetics, and other factors like that. So this is something just to keep in mind when you see somebody or you get a report and, my gosh, they've got 100 decibel, hearing loss. Well, just remember that, well, probably that isn't all noise. It's just not, and especially in the higher frequencies. So don't freak out when you see those numbers. So noise first affects the sensitive area in the hearing loss, or rather in the cochlea, and that sensitive area in the cochlea is responsible for hearing sounds at 3,000 to 6,000 hertz, 3,000 to 6,000 cycles per second. Noise-induced hearing loss typically begins around 3,000 to 4,000 hertz. It then progresses up the frequency spectrum and goes through to 4,000 and 6,000 hertz frequencies. Hearing eventually is affected at 8,000 hertz. And if the person doesn't get removed from the noise exposure, or doesn't just, and I've seen them, they just, nope, can't hear anything, I'm not going to wear hearing protection, you know, they're just adamant they won't do it. And then you'll see really high frequency hearing loss, and then they'll start losing the lower frequencies as well. And, you know, then the person's pretty much done. So the typical noise-induced hearing loss audiogram looks like this, with the, you know, it's kind of a pathognomonic, or it's diagnostic of noise-induced hearing loss, the 4,000 hertz notch. So you see fairly normal hearing thresholds at that 0.25 is 250 cycles per second, or hertz, 500 hertz, 1,000 hertz, 2,000 hertz, it starts to go down. And, you know, although it's not on this audiogram, 3,000 hertz, it's already going down. You're at 40 decibels at 3,000 hertz. And then at 4,000 hertz, now you're down to 50 decibels in the left ear, 45 decibels in the right ear. And then again, because the really high frequencies are preserved until the very end, hearing should improve at the really high frequencies. And just so you remember to compare this with, this is the noise-induced audiogram, and here's that age-related audiogram. And I think you can, everyone will agree there's a difference between these two audiograms. You don't see that 4K notch that you do in this noise-induced audiogram. So that's another thing, and this is why if somebody says they have hearing loss and they're filing a claim, the first thing you should ask is, have you had an audiogram? And if they say no, then the first thing you want to do is you need to get an audiogram. Okay, prove it. You know, let's see your noise. Let's see your noise exposure. Let's see how your ears are actually working. And then the second thing you should be asking them, we're going to get into this a little bit later, is do you have any old audiograms to compare with the current one? Because that's another big deal. So I'm going to give you a couple of scenarios here. This is kind of giving you an idea of temporary versus permanent hearing loss. There's a teenage girl who was seen for a physical exam. She had an audiogram, and her hearing thresholds were pretty high, 30 decibels at 4,000 hertz. That was kind of high for somebody who's in their teenage years. And they sent her to an audiologist who did a full hearing audiogram and found the notch pattern at 4,000 hertz. They questioned the girl who they found out had spending hours a day listening to music through her headphones. And then the night before she had her hearing screening, she went to a rock concert without wearing any hearing protection. You know, and after the concert, she noticed that she had ringing in the ears and she felt like they were stuffed with cotton. And then several days later, you know, when they retested her, her hearing had returned to normal. This is kind of something that...
John, we have 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So this is something that we do see, and it's a temporary threshold shift. And it's common with people that are exposed to excessive but short-term noise. And if you will, those little hair cells in the cochlea are stunned but not destroyed. You know, usually you get complete recovery of hearing. And the problem with this is that with repeated exposures, you will ultimately kill those hair cells and you'll have progressive loss, permanent loss of hearing. The second scenario is someone who really has it. It's a 55-year-old factory worker. So right off the bat, 55 years old, not a teenager. He's got ringing in his ears. He's a little depressed because, you know, and his depression began just after he started getting tinnitus. So it's just a side note, there are all kinds of conditions that are related to hearing loss, including depression and dementia. So when someone starts talking about all that, don't blow them off, because this is real. He seldom wore hearing protection at work. He was found that he had to shout to communicate with coworkers. And when he was away from work, he had difficulty with conversations in crowded rooms. You know, we'd get into a restaurant, couldn't hear anybody, was always shouting, what? He said that he often argued with his wife about the volume of the television because he always had to turn it way up. His physical examination, looking at his ears, were normal, but when he had an audiogram, he had high frequency hearing loss. And when he went to the audiologist, they confirmed sensory neural hearing loss, probably related to excessive noise exposure with superimposed age-related changes. Again, you know, the guy's 55. This case shows noise-induced hearing loss can interfere with speech discrimination. One of the things, if you get a full audiogram, you'll see a thing called a speech recognition threshold, SRT, and that's not the same as the pure tone audiogram. What speech recognition threshold is speech, and especially the high frequency consonants like S and T and C and P are high frequency sounds. And many times people with noise-induced hearing loss, or any form of hearing loss actually, but mostly noise-induced because it affects the higher frequencies, they won't hear those sounds. And because of that, speech becomes garbled for them, okay? And especially if they have loss of those higher frequencies in a crowded room with lots of background noise, they don't hear those high-pitched sounds. And tinnitus is another one that can occur and cause loss of reception of those high frequency sounds. They now have methods of actually measuring what frequency of tinnitus you're producing, and then give you noise canceling hearing aids to cancel out that tinnitus so you can hear, you know, if you will. One of the problems that you get with high frequency hearing loss, noise-induced hearing loss, again, is social isolation. That can cause depression. People will become insomniacs because they're just the ringing in the ears. I talk to people that say, I can't get to sleep. It's like somebody shouting in the ears all night long. I can't get to sleep. I haven't slept in weeks. Or they will have a greater risk of accidents, again, because they don't hear. They'll walk out into an intersection and not hear a car coming, or maybe even be so deaf they can't even hear a car honking at them as they get in front of it. They might be on a construction site and not hear the beeping of a dump truck as it's backing up. Those kinds of cues are just not heard, and they're at increased risk. New studies have shown that or all forms of hearing loss are also a strong risk factor, actually a very strong risk factor for dementia. So this is why we try to get people that are showing signs of hearing loss to, not only wear hearing protection, but to get hearing aids to, and we haven't figured out what it is about the temporal lobes where you actually hear and dementia, but there's a strong correlation between the two. And so people that have hearing loss really need amplification in order to prevent dementia. So now this is what you're going to be thinking about when you get a hearing loss claim on your desk. You want to first think about their age. If you're going to, and these are the things that you also want to talk to the person. If you're going to do some adjusters don't, some adjusters do interview the person by phone. These are the things that, you need to find out. How old are they? Do they have any family members with hearing loss? And it doesn't matter what kind of hearing loss. You really don't care. Do they have family members that lost their hearing? And in particular, do they have family members that lost hearing at a relatively young age, like 50? Have they ever had a head injury? Skull fracture can cause problems with hearing. Intravenous antibiotics, the gentamicin story, and other kinds of medications. Have you been on non-steroidal anti-inflammatories for a long time, like greater than a year? Do they have epilepsy? Because they might have temporal lobe epilepsy, and that might be messing with their auditory reception. Brain tumors are another one. Acoustic neuroma, it's a benign tumor of the acoustic nerve. It presses on it, and suddenly you've got problems with hearing, or you may have problems with balance. Type 2 diabetes is another one that's now been found to be associated with hearing loss. Tobacco smoking is also found to be associated with hearing loss. And so those are just the factors within themselves. And then also ask about extrinsic factors. You know, do they like to go out hunting? Do they like to go skeet shooting using a shotgun, bird hunting? Do they use hearing protection when they're out firing weapons? Did they have any military deployments? During military deployment, did they have a head injury? Were they a victim of like a improvised explosive where they survived and everything, but the concussion, the overpressure may have caused barotrauma? Do they use chainsaws or other power tools at work or at home? Do they like riding motorcycles? I always ask, do you wear a helmet? You know, and is it a full coverage helmet? Because that actually attenuates some of the noise. People don't realize just how much air, how much noise there is just in rushing air. I had a woman who was a graduate student when I was at 3M, and she would drive down to Ames, Iowa to go to grad school and then come back to the Twin Cities. And she didn't have air conditioning in her car. And so she would drive and it was summer class, and she would drive down to Ames, Iowa, which is like a 2-hour drive with the driver's side window down. And by the end of the summer, she had incredible ringing in her left ear. And she got some of that hearing back, but not all of it. She was always after that. And after that, she bought a car with, she got more money, and she got a car with air conditioning. But just the sound of rushing air from wind going past the window, that's still noise. Woodworking, metalworking, grinding, blacksmithing, welding, any of those kinds of things, all of that. You know, do they like to do yard work? Do they use a motorized lawn mower? Are they a farmer? Do they have maybe a hobby farm where they run a tractor? Do they use hearing protection when they do that? Do they like to play a musical instrument? Particularly, do they play in a band? You know, are they in a thrash metal band or a rock and roll band or something like that where they're putting out a lot of noise? And then also, finally, any recent motor vehicle collisions where their airbags may have deployed. All of these things we want to know about, just so you can kind of have an idea of whether this might be legit or if there are other factors that are sources of the person's hearing loss or their tinnitus. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions. We're going to send these articles out to everybody that's attending. This first one it's different. Now, this is a UK study, so, you know, the details are going to be different because they have different laws and the like, but the principles are the same. And I think it's a really good article for just understanding how we go about diagnosing noise-induced hearing loss for medical legal purposes. The other one, occupational noise exposure and hearing, it's probably the best review I've ever seen on just everything, all the different industries, all the different equipment, all the different kinds of exposures that can cause hearing loss. With that, I'll close it up and open it up for questions.